My name is Elaine Porter, and the night I stood outside room 814 hearing a stranger whisper, "Don't let her in," I realized my husband wasn't on a business trip. He was 2 floors above me celebrating our anniversary with someone else. I didn't knock. That's the part that still surprises people when I tell them this story. They imagine a woman my age, 62, married for 35 years, pounding on that door, demanding answers, making a scene. But I've never been that kind of woman. I was a school librarian for nearly 4 decades. I learned long ago that the truth doesn't need noise. It reveals itself if you're patient enough to listen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That morning had started like any other anniversary in recent years, quiet, unremarkable. Daniel and I hadn't been the kind of couple to celebrate much anymore. No flowers, no dinners out, just a polite acknowledgement, maybe a card if one of us remembered. Still, there had always been something steady about us, reliable, comfortable. At least that's what I told myself. At 9:12 a.m., my phone buzzed with his message. "I'm on a business trip. Happy anniversary." I stared at those words longer than I should have. Not because they were surprising, but because they felt rehearsed, too clean, too convenient, like something written out of obligation rather than feeling. Daniel had mentioned a trip earlier that week. Indianapolis, he said. Some regional meeting. Nothing unusual about that. He'd worked in sales for years. Travel was part of the job. But something about the message settled wrong in my chest. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the way he didn't call. Or maybe it was the quiet truth I'd been avoiding for years that we had stopped really talking a long time ago. I spent the morning moving through the house without purpose, folding laundry that didn't need folding, rearranging books I'd already organized twice. By noon, the silence felt heavier than usual. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed a small bag. It wasn't dramatic, just a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, and the novel I'd been trying to finish for weeks. I told myself it was a simple getaway, a change of scenery, a way to spend the anniversary on my own terms. Indianapolis was only a couple of hours away from Fort Wayne. I'd driven there countless times for conferences, for shopping, for the occasional visit with an old colleague. It felt familiar enough not to be intimidating, but distant enough to feel like an escape. I didn't tell Daniel. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I knew he wouldn't ask. The drive was quiet. Early fall had just started to touch the trees, and patches of orange and gold lined the highway. I remember thinking how strange it was that life could look so beautiful when something inside you felt unsettled. By the time I reached downtown Indianapolis, the afternoon sun was dipping low, casting long shadows between the buildings. I chose a hotel I'd stayed in once before, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable. The kind of place where no one asks too many questions. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. A television murmured somewhere behind the front desk. 2 people stood ahead of me in line checking in. I waited quietly, my suitcase beside me, my mind drifting. And then I heard it. "Yes, Mr. Porter checked in earlier today, room 814. The name hit me like a dropped glass. Porter. It's not the rarest name in the world, I knew that. But something in the clerk's tone, casual, familiar, made my stomach tighten. I stepped forward when it was my turn, forcing a small smile. Checking in, the young man behind the desk asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Reservation under Porter." He typed quickly, eyes scanning the screen. "Elaine Porter," he confirmed. "We've got you in room 612. 6th floor." I hesitated, then spoke as casually as I could. "Just out of curiosity, you wouldn't happen to have another Porter staying here, would you? My husband travels a lot, and sometimes we end up in the same place without realizing it." The lie came easier than I expected. He nodded without suspicion. "Actually, yes, Daniel Porter, checked in earlier this afternoon." There it was. Not a coincidence, not a mistake. A fact. "Do you know what floor?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "8th," he said. "Room 814. 2 floors above me." I thanked him, took my key, and walked toward the elevator with what I hoped looked like composure. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. The kind that arrives quietly without permission. In my room, I set my bag down on the bed and sat beside it, staring at nothing. The air conditioning hummed softly. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Daniel hadn't mentioned this hotel. He hadn't mentioned much of anything, if I was being honest. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the thought I'd been avoiding. What if he isn't alone? I didn't cry, I didn't panic. Instead, I stood up. I smoothed my blouse, checked my reflection in the mirror, and reached for my room key. If the truth was 2 floors above me, I was going to look it in the eye. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. The numbers lit up 1 by 1, 7, 8. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched out in both directions, quiet and carpeted, the kind of silence that makes every step sound louder than it is. Room 814 wasn't hard to find. I walked slowly, my heart steady but heavy, like it knew something I hadn't fully accepted yet. As I got closer, I heard it. Laughter. A woman's laughter. Soft, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I stopped just short of the door. For a moment, I considered turning back, pretending I'd never come up here, preserving whatever illusion I still had left. But then I heard a voice inside, low, urgent. "Don't let her in." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried through the door like a warning. Not surprise, not confusion. Expectation. Like I was someone they had already prepared for. I stood there, my hand inches from the door, and felt something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. Because in that moment I understood something clearly. Whatever was happening behind that door had been happening for a long time. And whatever I thought my marriage was, it wasn't that anymore. I lowered my hand. I turned around. And I walked back to the elevator without making a sound. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical sigh, and I watched the number drop from 8 to 6, as if it were counting down to something final. I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't feel weak. If anything, I felt strangely steady, like a person who had just stepped out of a storm and realized the sky had already cleared, even if the ground was still wet beneath her feet. When I reached my room, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I set my key on the small table by the door and stood there in the dimness, listening to the quiet hum of the building. For 35 years, I had shared a life with Daniel Porter, and in less than 5 minutes I had seen enough to understand that life had been quietly rewritten without me. Still, understanding something and accepting it are not the same. I sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up my phone. His message was still there, simple and clean. "I'm on a business trip. Happy anniversary." I read it again, this time with a different kind of clarity. It wasn't just a lie, it was a polished one. A sentence designed to close a conversation before it even began. My thumb hovered over his name. I could call him. I could say I'm here. I could walk back upstairs and knock until he had no choice but to open that door. But then I thought about the voice I'd heard. "Don't let her in." That wasn't panic. That wasn't confusion. That was preparation. They knew exactly who I was. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. I set the phone down. If I was going to face this, I needed more than a moment of anger. I needed the full picture. The next morning came quietly. I slept, though not deeply, and woke before sunrise. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then it came back all at once, the hotel, the hallway, the voice. I dressed carefully, the same way I used to before going into the library each day. There was something comforting in routine even now. Downstairs, the lobby was nearly empty. A different clerk stood at the desk, this time older, with a kind but tired expression. I approached him with a polite smile. "Good morning," I said. "Morning," he replied. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated just long enough to make it seem natural. "I'm supposed to meet someone for breakfast," I said, "but I think I may have gotten the room number wrong. Would you mind checking if a Daniel Porter is staying here?" He glanced at his screen, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, room 814. Hearing it confirmed again from a different person made it feel even more solid. Less like a misunderstanding, more like a fact I could hold in my hands. "Thank you," I said. I didn't ask anything else, not yet. Instead, I made my way to the small restaurant off the lobby. It was the kind of place that served coffee in thick white mugs and eggs any way you liked them. I ordered a simple breakfast and chose a table with a clear view of the elevators. If they were staying here together, they would have to come down eventually. I wasn't sure how long I sat there. Long enough for my coffee to go cold, long enough for the room to fill and empty again. And then I saw them. Daniel stepped out of the elevator first, wearing the same navy jacket he'd packed earlier that week, but it wasn't his appearance that caught my attention. It was the way he turned back smiling. I hadn't seen that smile in years. A moment later, she stepped out beside him. She was younger than me, but not young, mid-40s maybe. Well-dressed, confident, the kind of woman who carried herself as if she belonged wherever she stood. She touched his arm lightly as they walked, and he leaned toward her without hesitation. Familiar. Comfortable. Intimate. I looked down at my plate, my hands resting quietly on either side of it. I didn't want them to see me, not yet. Not like this. They passed through the lobby and out the front doors, talking softly to each other. I caught only fragments of their conversation, but I didn't need the words. Their body language said enough. This wasn't new. This wasn't accidental. This was a life. A separate, carefully maintained life. I finished my coffee slowly, though I couldn't taste it. Then I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked back to the front desk. The older clerk looked up as I approached. "Everything okay, ma'am?" "Yes," I said gently. "I just had a quick question. The gentleman in 814, does he stay here often?" He hesitated, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Then he gave a small shrug. "Off and on," he said. "Couple times a month, I think. Business travelers tend to stick with places they like." "A couple times a month?" The words settled into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. "And the woman he's with," I asked, keeping my tone casual, "is she part of his reservation?" He glanced at the screen again. "No, ma'am. Separate check-in. Different last name." Of course it was. "Thank you," I said, offering a polite smile before turning away. Back in my room, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed a second to let the truth settle fully. Daniel hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been consistent. Careful. Organized. That requires effort. Planning. Time. All the things he used to tell me he didn't have. I walked over to the small desk by the window and pulled out the notepad provided by the hotel. The pen felt oddly heavy in my hand. For most of my life, I had used writing to keep track of things, book inventories, reading lists, schedules, small, orderly details. Now I began writing something different. Dates. Times. Room numbers. Names. Daniel Porter, room 814, checked in Friday afternoon. Woman mid-40s, dark hair, separate reservation. I didn't know exactly what I would do with this information yet, but I knew I needed it. Because whatever came next, I wasn't going to walk into it unprepared. I set the pen down and looked out the window at the city below. Cars moved steadily through the streets. People went about their day unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in my life. For the first time since I'd heard that whisper through the door, I allowed myself to feel something close to anger. Not loud, not explosive. Just steady. Grounded. The kind of anger that doesn't rush, it waits. And I realized sitting there in that small hotel room that I wasn't going to confront Daniel in the hallway. I wasn't going to beg for explanations or demand apologies. Because whatever he had to say, I wanted the truth before he had the chance to shape it. I didn't leave the room right away. There's a moment after the truth reveals itself when your life splits quietly in two, the part before you knew and the part after. I sat at that small desk, the hotel notepad in front of me, and realized I had already stepped into the second half. What I did next would matter. Not just for what I learned, but for who I became afterward. I picked up the pen again and turned to a fresh page. For years, I had lived a life built on trust. Not blind trust, I wasn't naive, but the kind that grows slowly over decades. The kind that doesn't question every late meeting or every missed call. Now I wasn't erasing that trust. I was examining what had replaced it. Around mid-morning, I went back downstairs. This time, I didn't linger in the restaurant. I walked past the front desk with a calm, familiar confidence, like someone who had every right to be there. Because I did. Near the elevators, there was a seating area, 2 armchairs, a low table, and a tall plant that looked like it had been there longer than most of the staff. I chose the chair with the best angle of the entrance and sat down, a magazine open in my lap. I wasn't reading it. I was waiting. It didn't take long. They returned just before noon, stepping in from the street with the ease of people who had nothing to hide, at least not in public. Daniel held the door open for her. She smiled up at him and he said something that made her laugh again. That laugh. I had heard it once before, muffled through a hotel door. Now it was clear, warm, and completely unguarded. They didn't see me. Why would they? To them, I was at home, safe, predictable, accounted for. They crossed the lobby and stopped briefly near the front desk. I kept my eyes lowered, turning a page I hadn't read, but I listened. "Same as usual," the clerk asked. "Yeah," Daniel said. "We'll be here through Sunday." Same as usual. The phrase echoed in my mind. Not a one-time mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A pattern. They headed toward the elevators, standing close but not touching now, careful in a way that suggested practice. When the doors opened, they stepped inside, and just before they disappeared, she reached out and brushed something invisible off his sleeve. A small intimate gesture. The kind that comes from habit. The doors closed. I sat there for another minute, letting the quiet settle again, then closed the magazine and stood up. If this was usual, then it had a rhythm. And rhythms leave traces. Back at the front desk, the older clerk greeted me with a polite nod. "Ma'am? I hope you don't mind another question," I said, my tone light but respectful. "My husband travels a lot for work, and I'm trying to coordinate a surprise visit. Do you happen to know how often Mr. Porter stays here?" He smiled faintly as if he'd heard similar questions before. "Hard to say exactly," he replied. "But I've seen him a few times over the past several months. Always checks in for a couple of nights." Several months? That was longer than I'd expected, and somehow not long enough to explain the depth of comfort I'd just witnessed. "And the woman," I asked, lowering my voice slightly, "is she usually with him?" He hesitated again, more noticeably this time. "I really shouldn't." "I understand," I said gently. "I'm not looking to cause trouble, just trying to avoid an awkward surprise." That seemed to settle him. "She's been here with him before," he admitted quietly. "Different reservations, but yes." I nodded, offering a small appreciative smile. "Thank you," I said. "You've been very helpful." I turned away before he could see anything in my expression shift. Because something had... Back in my room, I added to my notes. Several months, same hotel, same pattern. Then I paused. This wasn't just about when or where. It was about who. The woman. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew she wasn't accidental. She moved through his life with familiarity, with ease. That kind of presence doesn't appear overnight. I needed to understand her place in this. Later that afternoon, I took the elevator back up to the 8th floor. Not to confront. To observe. The hallway was quiet, just as it had been the night before. Room 814 stood at the end, unchanged, unremarkable, just another door in a long line of identical ones. I walked past it once slowly, my steps soft against the carpet. No voices this time. No laughter. Just silence. I kept walking, turned the corner, then circled back after a few minutes. Still nothing. But as I passed again, I noticed something small. A housekeeping cart parked a few doors down. An older woman in a uniform was folding towels with practiced efficiency. I approached her with a polite smile. "Excuse me," I said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." She looked up, friendly but cautious. "No, ma'am. What can I do for you?" "I'm trying to leave a note for my husband," I said, gesturing vaguely down the hall. "But I think I might have the wrong room." "Do you happen to know if the gentleman in 814 is traveling alone?" She gave a small chuckle. "Oh no," she said. "He's got company. Nice lady too. They've been in and out all morning." Nice lady. I felt something tighten in my chest, not jealousy, not even anger. Just the quiet sting of being replaced in someone else's version of normal. "Do you know her name by any chance?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. The housekeeper shook her head. "No, ma'am, but she always checks in separate. I've seen her here before, though." Before. Another confirmation. Another piece. "Thank you," I said softly. I turned and walked back toward the elevator, my reflection briefly catching in one of the framed mirrors along the wall. I stopped for just a second. I looked the same. The same woman who had driven here yesterday. The same woman who had spent decades building a life with someone she trusted. And yet everything had shifted. Not outwardly. But underneath. Back in my room, I sat down and read through everything I'd written so far. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see the outline of something larger. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. Routine. A second life built carefully alongside the first. And if Daniel had gone to that much effort to create it, then there were parts of his life I hadn't even begun to see. I set the notepad aside and picked up my phone. For a moment I considered searching his messages, his email, anything I could access. But then I stopped. Number. I didn't want fragments. I wanted the full truth. The kind that couldn't be denied, reshaped, or softened. And for that I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. I looked at the clock. It was just past 3. Plenty of time left in the day. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. Because somewhere in this city was a woman who knew my husband well enough to share his life. And I intended to find out exactly who she was. I stepped out into the late afternoon air with a clearer sense of purpose than I'd felt in years. Indianapolis moved around me like it always did, steady traffic, people heading home from work, the quiet rhythm of a city minding its own business. For most of my life I had been part of that rhythm, predictable, reliable. Now, for the first time, I was moving outside of it. I didn't know the woman's name yet, but I knew enough to begin. She was confident, comfortable in that hotel, familiar to the staff. That suggested she wasn't hiding in the way someone new to an affair might. She had settled into it. And people who settle into something tend to leave trails. I started with the simplest place I could think of, the hotel parking structure. Daniel had driven down. I'd seen his car the night before, a silver Toyota Camry, easy to recognize after all these years. If she was staying separately, she likely had her own vehicle. The garage was dim and quiet, the concrete echoing softly with distant footsteps. I walked slowly through the rows, scanning license plates, looking for anything that stood out. It didn't take long. Daniel's car was exactly where I remembered, parked neatly near one of the pillars. And a few spaces over there was a dark blue SUV I didn't recognize. Clean, newer model Indiana plates. On impulse, I stepped closer. There was nothing remarkable at first glance. But then I noticed a small detail, a real estate company logo printed on the back window. Hayes Realty Group. I repeated the name quietly to myself. Hayes. It settled into place with a kind of quiet certainty. Back upstairs, I didn't go straight to my room. Instead, I stopped in the lobby and took a seat near the business center, 2 computers, a printer, and a stack of local brochures. I opened one of the computers and typed in the name. Hayes Realty Group, Indianapolis. The website came up quickly. Clean, professional, filled with photos of smiling agents standing in front of sold properties. I clicked through the staff page slowly. And there she was. Caroline Hayes. The photo was unmistakable, the same woman I had seen in the lobby standing beside my husband, as if she belonged there. Dark hair, confident smile, eyes that looked directly into the camera without hesitation. Mid-40s, just as I'd guessed. Divorced, according to her brief bio. Specializing in residential properties across the Indianapolis area. I leaned back in the chair, letting the information settle. She had a name. A profession. A life that existed fully outside of whatever she shared with Daniel. This wasn't some hidden, shadowy figure. She was real, visible, established. And somehow that made everything feel even more deliberate. I printed the page not because I needed to, but because having something tangible in my hands made it feel less like a suspicion and more like a fact. Caroline Hayes. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in my purse. By the time I returned to my room, the sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat at the desk again and added her name to my notes. Caroline Hayes, Realtor, Indianapolis. For a moment, I just stared at the words. Then I added another line. Not hidden. Because she wasn't. Daniel hadn't chosen someone who needed to stay invisible. He had chosen someone with a life, a presence, a place in the world. Which meant this relationship wasn't built on secrecy alone. It was built on intention. That realization brought a different kind of pain. Not sharper, but deeper. I thought about the years Daniel and I had spent building our life together. The house in Fort Wayne, the routines, the quiet evenings, the way we had slowly, almost imperceptibly stopped sharing parts of ourselves. Had he felt this shift long before I did? Had he already started building something new while I was still tending to what we had? I shook the thought away. Understanding his reasons didn't change what he had done. And it certainly didn't excuse it. Later that evening, I went back downstairs, not to observe this time, but simply to exist in the same space as them again, to confirm what I already knew. The restaurant was moderately busy. I chose a table near the back where I could see the entrance without being easily noticed. They arrived together. This time there was no distance between them. He placed his hand lightly at the small of her back as they walked in a gesture so natural, so practiced, it made something inside me go very still. They sat a few tables away, close enough that I could hear pieces of their conversation. Next weekend might be tricky, Daniel was saying. I've got to be in Fort Wayne. Caroline nodded. Then we'll work around it, she replied easily. We always do. We always do. The words echoed in my mind. This wasn't just an affair. It was a schedule, a system, a second life running parallel to mine. I watched them for a while, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. Every glance, every gesture added to the picture I was building. Daniel laughed more with her. He leaned in closer. He listened. All the things that had quietly faded from our marriage had found their way here. And yet as I sat there, I didn't feel replaced. I felt erased. As if the version of me that had shared those moments with him had simply been edited out of his life. I finished my meal slowly and left before they did. Back in my room, I added the final notes of the day. Dinner together, comfortable, routine established. Then I stopped writing. Because the next realization came not from observation but from something deeper. If Daniel had been coming here regularly, if he had been maintaining this relationship for months, then there were likely parts of our shared life he had already begun to separate. Finances. Accounts. Plans. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights beginning to flicker on. For years I had trusted that what we built together was shared. Now I wasn't so sure. And if there was one thing I had learned from a lifetime of quiet work and careful attention, it was this. When something looks stable on the surface but feels wrong underneath, you don't ignore it. You look deeper. Because the truth is almost always there. Waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind had shifted into something quieter, sharper. The kind of focus I used to have when cataloging rare books or tracking down a missing record that no one else could find. Every detail mattered. Every pattern meant something. By morning, I knew what I needed to do next. Understanding Daniel's relationship with Caroline had given me one piece of the truth. But if I was going to move forward calmly, deliberately, I needed to understand something even more important. What he had done with our life? I checked out of the hotel just after 8. The same young clerk from my first day was back behind the desk. He smiled politely as he processed my checkout, unaware that he had been part of something far more significant than a routine stay. Everything all right with your room, he asked? Yes, I said, returning the smile. It was exactly what I needed. That at least was true. The drive back to Fort Wayne felt different from the drive down. The same roads, the same trees, but I wasn't the same woman behind the wheel. There was no more uncertainty, no more vague unease. Just direction. When I pulled into the driveway of our home, everything looked exactly as I had left it. The porch light still slightly crooked, the mailbox leaning just a bit to the right. The quiet familiarity of a life that from the outside hadn't changed at all. Inside the house was still. Daniel wouldn't be back until Sunday. I had time. I set my bag down in the bedroom and walked straight to the small office we had shared for years. It wasn't much, just a desk, a filing cabinet, and a bookshelf filled with old manuals and paperwork, but it held something more valuable now than it ever had before. Records. I sat down at the desk and opened the top drawer. For decades, we had managed our finances together in a simple, straightforward way. Joint accounts, shared bills, nothing complicated. At least that's what I had believed. I began with the basics: bank statements, tax returns, retirement accounts. Everything was neatly organized, just as I had always kept it. But as I moved through the documents, something small began to stand out. Transfers. At first, they looked ordinary amounts moving between accounts, routine adjustments. But the more I looked, the more I noticed a pattern. Regular withdrawals. Consistent amounts, always spaced a few weeks apart. And always moving into an account I didn't recognize. I paused, my hand resting on the edge of the desk. Then I kept going. In the back of the drawer, tucked behind older records, I found a folder I didn't remember organizing. It wasn't labeled clearly, just a simple tab with the word Statements. I opened it slowly. Inside were printouts from an account I had never seen before. Daniel's name was on it. Only his name. The balance wasn't enormous, but it wasn't small either, enough to matter, enough to represent intention. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning dates and transactions. Hotel charges. Restaurant bills. Gas stations in Indianapolis. It was all there. Not hidden well enough to disappear, but hidden just enough that I would never have noticed if I hadn't been looking. I closed the folder carefully and set it on the desk. For a moment, I simply sat there letting the reality settle. This wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a practical one. A division of resources. A quiet redrawing of the life we had built together. And that changed everything. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water I didn't really need. My hands were steady, my breathing even. Still no anger. Just clarity. I returned to the office and gathered the documents I would need, copies of statements, account numbers, anything that showed the pattern clearly. I didn't rush, I didn't panic. I worked the way I always had. Carefully. Thoroughly. When I was finished, I placed everything into a neat folder and set it aside. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone and called someone for help. Her name was Linda Carver. We had worked together briefly at the library decades ago before she went back to school and became an attorney. We hadn't stayed close, but we had kept in touch over the years, holiday cards, occasional lunches. She answered on the third ring. "Elaine, it's been a while." "It has," I said, my voice calm. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Not at all. What's going on?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to say, but because saying it out loud made it real in a different way. "I need some advice," I said finally, "about finances and about separation." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then her voice softened. "All right," she said. "Why don't you come by this afternoon? We can talk." Her office was just a short drive away. I arrived early, the folder of documents resting neatly in my bag. Linda greeted me with a warm but professional expression, the kind that balanced familiarity with discretion. We sat across from each other in her office, the door closed. I handed her the folder. She took her time reviewing it, her eyes moving carefully across each page. I watched her expression shift, not dramatically, but enough to tell me she understood what she was seeing. "He's been maintaining a separate account," she said finally. "Yes." "And these transfers regular, consistent?" "Yes." She looked up at me. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday," I said, "about all of it." She nodded slowly. "And what do you want to do?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. I thought about the hotel hallway, the whisper behind the door, the life Daniel had built without me. Then I thought about the years before that, the quiet routines, the trust I had given freely. "I don't want to react," I said carefully. "I want to proceed." Linda's expression shifted slightly, something like approval passing through her eyes. "Then we do this properly," she said. "We document everything, we protect your assets, and when you're ready, we address it directly." I nodded. That was exactly what I needed. Not revenge. Not chaos. Structure. By the time I left her office, the sun was beginning to set again. Another day closing, but this one felt different from the last. I wasn't standing outside a door anymore, listening to a life I didn't understand. I was standing firmly inside my own. And for the first time since that message appeared on my phone, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. By Sunday evening, the house had settled into its usual quiet. I had spent the weekend moving through familiar spaces with a different kind of awareness, touching things, not as a wife maintaining a home, but as someone preparing to step away from it. I cooked simple meals, watered the plants, folded laundry. From the outside, nothing had changed. But everything had. Daniel's car pulled into the driveway just after 6. I heard the engine cut off, the soft thud of the door closing, the measured footsteps approaching the front porch. For a moment I stood in the kitchen, my hands resting lightly on the counter, listening. Then I turned and set the table. Not elaborately, just 2 plates, 2 glasses, a simple meal I knew he liked: roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was an act of clarity. The door opened behind me. "Elaine," he called out. In the kitchen, I replied, my voice even. He stepped in a moment later, setting his bag down by the door. He looked tired, the way he often did after a trip. But there was something else there too, a faint tension, like he was already bracing for something he couldn't quite name. "Smells good," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "You didn't have to." "I know," I said gently. "Sit down." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then pulled out his chair and sat. We ate in silence at first. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a deliberate one. I wanted him to settle into it, to feel the normalcy before it shifted. Halfway through the meal, he glanced up at me. "How was your weekend?" he asked. It was a simple question, casual, practiced. I set my fork down carefully. "Productive," I said. He nodded, taking another bite as if that answered everything. For a moment I watched him, really watched him. The man I had shared a life with for over 3 decades. The small habits I knew by heart. The way he held his fork, the way he leaned slightly to one side when he sat. Familiar, and yet not. "I went to Indianapolis," I said. The effect was immediate. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't drop his fork or look up sharply, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tightening, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. "I thought you might have," he said after a moment. "You mentioned wanting a change of scenery." "I stayed at the Hawthorne Hotel downtown." This time he did look up. Just briefly. Just enough. "That's a nice place," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It is," I agreed. "Very accommodating staff." He nodded slowly, but he didn't speak. I reached beside me and picked up the folder I had placed on the chair earlier. I set it gently on the table between us. "I also had some time to think," I continued, "and to look into a few things." He stared at the folder, now not touching it. "Elaine, I know about the account," I said, not raising my voice. "The one in your name only, the transfers, the hotel charges." His hand moved slightly, then stopped. "I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said, "but I'd prefer if you didn't, not yet." That stopped him. He looked at me then, not defensively, not angrily, but with something closer to uncertainty. I opened the folder and slid a few of the documents toward him. Not all of them, just enough. His eyes moved across the pages. I watched as recognition settled in, followed by something heavier. There was no point denying it. "I went to the hotel," I said quietly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Elaine." "I stood outside your room," I continued. "Room 814. His shoulders dropped slightly, the last of his composure slipping. "I heard her," I said. "I saw you together the next morning." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything that had gone unsaid for months, maybe years. Finally he spoke. It wasn't supposed to. He started, then stopped himself. I didn't plan for it to become this. "No," I said calmly. "You planned everything else." He flinched just slightly. "That's not fair," he said, though there was no real conviction in it. "Isn't it?" I asked. I leaned back in my chair, not in anger, but in distance. "You didn't just have an affair, Daniel," I said. "You built a life, a schedule, a system. You made room for it." He rubbed his forehead, his voice lower now. "I was unhappy," he said. "We both were. You know that." "Yes," I said. "We were quiet. We were distant. But we were still here." He looked at me, then something like desperation creeping in. "I didn't know how to fix it," he admitted. "I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. It felt like we had already drifted too far." "And your solution," I said gently, "was to drift somewhere else." He didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. We sat there for a long moment, the weight of it all settling between us. "I'm not here to argue," I said finally. "And I'm not here to make a scene." He looked up confused. "Then what are you here for?" he asked. I met his gaze steadily. "To end this properly." The words landed quietly but firmly. "I've spoken to an attorney," I continued. "I've documented everything. The accounts, the transactions. I'm not interested in taking more than what's fair, but I won't accept less." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time in years. "You've already decided," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was no hesitation. "No doubt." "I didn't make this decision in the hallway outside your hotel room," I added softly. "I made it afterward. When I understood what you had done, not just to me, but to the life we built." He looked down at the table, his hands resting on either side of the folder. "I never meant to hurt you like this," he said quietly. I believed him. That was the hardest part. "I know," I said, "but you did." Another silence. Not tense this time. Just final. I'll move out, he said after a while. Give me a few days. I nodded. That's fine. He hesitated, then asked the question I knew was coming. Is there any chance we can fix this? I considered it. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it deserved to be considered. Then I shook my head. No, I said gently. What we had needed honesty to survive, and we lost that a long time ago. He nodded slowly as if he had expected it. We finished the meal in silence after that. Not as husband and wife, but as two people who had finally told the truth. The house felt different once Daniel started packing. Not emptier, just quieter in a way that felt honest. He moved through the rooms carefully over the next few days, taking only what he needed at first. Clothes, a few personal items, his shaving kit from the bathroom. We spoke when necessary, but we didn't linger in conversation. There was no anger left between us, no raised voices. Just distance. On Wednesday morning, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his car keys in his hand. I'll come back for the rest this weekend, he said. I nodded. That's fine. He hesitated as if he wanted to say something more. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation he hadn't found the words for yet. But in the end, he didn't. Take care, Elaine, he said quietly. You too, Daniel. And then he left. I stood there for a moment after the door closed, listening to the fading sound of his car pulling away. 35 years doesn't end with a single moment. It dissolves slowly in quiet steps like that. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because the sadness had already moved through me. What remained was something steadier. Space. In the weeks that followed, life began to rearrange itself. There were practical things to handle: meetings with Linda, paperwork decisions about the house and finances. We approached it the way we had approached everything else in those final days, calmly, directly, without unnecessary conflict. Daniel kept his word. He didn't argue over assets. He didn't try to hide anything further. In a strange way, he became more honest in the end than he had been in years. I appreciated that. But it didn't change my decision. I stayed in the house, not because I was holding on to the past, but because I wasn't ready to let go of everything at once. Some things deserved to remain, at least for a while. I began making small changes. Nothing dramatic. I rearranged the living room, donated clothes I no longer wore, cleared out drawers that had been untouched for years. Each change was quiet, deliberate, like turning a page instead of closing a book. Megan visited often. She didn't ask too many questions. She didn't need to. She had always been perceptive, and she understood more than I said. One afternoon we sat together on the back porch, the early autumn air carrying that familiar crispness. Are you okay? She asked gently. I considered the question. Yes, I said, I think I am. She nodded, accepting the answer as it was. I always thought you were stronger than you let people see, she said after a moment. I smiled faintly. I think I just never had a reason to prove it. That wasn't entirely true. But it felt true enough now. As time passed, I found myself returning to things I had quietly set aside over the years. Reading, of course, that had never left me, but also volunteering at the local library, helping organize community events, even joining a small book group that met once a week. Nothing extraordinary. Just a life. My life. Daniel reached out once about 3 months after he moved out. It wasn't a long message. I'm sorry for everything. I see it more clearly now. I don't expect anything, I just wanted you to know. I read it twice before responding. Thank you for saying that. I hope you find what you're looking for. That was all. No anger. No reopening of old wounds. Just acknowledgement. I later heard through Megan that things with Caroline hadn't lasted. Not in the way he had imagined, at least. Without secrecy, without the careful structure he had built around it, the relationship had changed. I wasn't surprised. Some things only exist in the shadows. And once exposed to light, they don't always survive. But that was his story to live through. Not mine. Mine was here. In the quiet of my home. In the steady rhythm of days that no longer depended on someone else's choices. In the understanding that what had happened to me did not define me. One evening, months later, I found myself thinking about that night in the hotel. The hallway. The door. The whisper. Don't let her in. I realized something then. They hadn't been keeping me out of that room. They had been keeping me out of the truth. And the moment I turned away from that door, I had already stepped toward it. Not the truth they were hiding, but my own. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street as the sun began to set. The light stretched long across the pavement, soft and steady. For years I had believed that stability meant staying, that endurance meant silence. But I had learned something different. Love doesn't fade all at once. It drifts. It softens. It disappears in the spaces where honesty used to live. And if you ignore those spaces long enough, you can lose more than just the person beside you. You can lose yourself. I didn't lose myself. I found her again. Not in anger. Not in revenge. But in the simple, steady act of choosing truth over comfort. If you've ever stood outside a door unsure whether to knock or walk away, I hope you remember this. You don't need to force your way into something that no longer belongs to you. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is turn around and build a life that no one can quietly take from you again. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or something you're still trying to understand, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, you're always welcome to listen and be part of this space.